Hello and welcome to D6 Damage. Today we're spotlighting another race, the mighty Dwarf. Now personally, my experience with dwarves begins and ends with Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, so I've brought in my friend, a dwarf connoisseur, if you will, D4. Say hi, buddy.
Hey, thanks for inviting me.
No problem. So, let's really dig, if you'll pardon my terrible pun, into the dwarf. What does it mean to be a dwarf? Game-wise.
Game-wise, to be a dwarf, you are essentially the depending on your character, you are the gruff, kind of hard-drinking character. That is depending on your character, like I said. You could go for a completely flamboyant dwarf who's a fighter if you're into that kind of thing. Personally, with my dwarves, most of them I kind of stick to the Nordic aesthetic of it. Hard drinking, hard fighting, hard working, most of the time quite serious, but they love to tell their stories. And that reminds me, I do have quite the story involving one dwarf in particular when I was playing 3.5 D&D.
Oh yeah, this one is a gem. Oh god, I can't stop with the puns today. So, let's look at the dwarf stats for a second, starting with Pathfinder. Pathfinder dwarves get a +2 to Constitution, Wisdom, and a -2 to Charisma. So what does that mean just in terms of class optimization?
In terms of class optimization, it pretty much means don't play a class where you're going to be relying on charisma too much. So
okay, so no sorcerer, no bard, no really talky party face rogue.
Well, you could do those options provided you compensate somehow for that loss.
Okay, so that's investing some fairly hefty points if you're doing point buy, or putting your best roll into charisma if you want to play like a dwarf bard, for example.
Exactly. Another option would be that you go for something that's a good combination of those two traits, the wisdom and the constitution, but at the same time not so reliant on the charisma, something like a paladin. And paladins of Moradin, dwarf god in D&D, are much more common than some people like to give them credit for.
Cleric is not a bad choice for the dwarf because you do get that +2 to wisdom, but you do have the channeling to think about, which runs off your charisma. Now, what I think is a really good class choice for the dwarf is Ranger. What do you think of Dwarf Rangers?
Dwarf Rangers, when I think of a Dwarf Ranger, the only thing that really comes to mind is Varix from Dragon Age 2. Using that big crossbow, but at the same time, he reminds me very much of a bard with his storytelling and narrating the story in general. I actually have not seen a Dwarf Ranger, per se, in my experience. I'm sure there's lots of players out there who've done them, or at least tried them. But in my opinion, dwarves are more suited to the in-your-face kind of combat.
Which you can do with a ranger, with their D10 hit die and all, but let's talk about the really powerful martial classes as choices, like fighter.
Yes, a dwarf fighter, for me, is almost as common a choice for me as playing a human fighter. There's a lot of options in general, but my favorite, and this is the one I used in the story that I'm going to tell you later, was dwarf who used a dwarven war axe and a bastard sword. Now, you know me, and I love bastard swords, so of course I'm going to use the bastard sword if I'm dual wielding. But when you do the DPS dwarf at close combat with that combination, you already have a high constitution next to a high dex, of course. Mm-hmm. But the one drawback might be you have no shield. You don't have that extra bit of defense or AC you can get from having a shield. So that character needs that heavier armor, which is where the Dwarven's strength comes in.
Mm-hmm. Now, you know what strikes me as a very terrifying idea? Dwarf Barbarian.
I've seen that combination before. The campaign that involved the story I'm going to tell you had a dwarven barbarian who actually had the funniest little rage trigger. He raged whenever someone made fun of his height. So, example, he called him short, rage. And he used an interesting weapon called a razor buckler, which raised his defense, but also allowed him to do massive melee damage.
All right, so now why don't you give us that story?
Right. It was 2011, maybe early 2012. D12 was running a game at a friend's house, and I was playing my dual-wielding dwarf DPS. And I actually named him after one of the dwarves I'll tell you about later when we reference dwarves in literature, Auric from the Inheritance trilogy. I used that name because I liked the character. And Auric had just lost his armor in the quest we had just completed. He got pancaked with his armor saving his life by a thread by a booby trap that essentially was a falling pillar. And
you were going to a flying city, right?
Yeah. We were going... it was a floating city. It was a floating city. We had to teleport up. And Auric was quite depressed about leaving his armor behind because it was essentially scrap metal at that point by the time he got pulled out of the trap. So the queen of the city, who we couldn't look at for some reason, I can't recall. I think it was because we were going to go insane or blind if we saw her because she was like pure goody-good or something. Anyway, she rewarded Auric and most of the members of the party with valuable items. Auric got a full suit, mind you, of Dwarven mountain plate. This in D&D 3.5, this is the heaviest of heavy armor you can get, as far as I knew at the time.
That's made from solid stone, right?
No, that's stone plate. Mountain plate is damn close, though. Thankfully, it wasn't adamantine, otherwise it would have been very expensive mountain plate. But anyway, mountain plate, essentially, for those who don't know, it is pure armor, as in this suit is heavy enough that if you are brought onto the field with this, you are not walking, you are being rolled on in a gurney, and then you have to stand up, or they have you on or they trail you in on a dolly. That's how it was described to me at the time, so I was picturing something like an Iron Man suit or something, maybe even heavier, more like Hulkbuster. Anyway, back to the story. After Auric received his mountain plate, the city was attacked by dragons.
Always scary. Now these were terrifying chromatic dragons. You weren't attacked by friendly metallic dragons, right?
Always chromatic. Always evil. There was a big black one and a couple of red ones, if I recall, circling the city. You'd have to ask D12 to confirm that. I don't even think he remembers that far back.
So, acid or fire? Decisions.
Yeah, how to die today. Back to the story. The city's defenses consisted of many ballistas, and the party was asked to man quite a few of them. Auric, along with the rest of the party, were not proficient with these weapons, so we had to do multiple rolls to use them. Loading them, firing them, reloading them, pulling the string back. When you look at a ballista, it's a very complex war machine. Anyway, Auric got some bad rolls. I'm going to go into detail about this. The first shot Auric fired at one of these red dragons, or black, I can't remember, went off just fine. It was on the reload that he got on top to load this thing, pulling the string back. I rolled a 1. His foot got caught. D12 asked me to roll again to confirm. To confirm and to get my foot out. I rolled a 1 again. At this point, the ballista went off. And poor Auric, in his mountain plate, his shiny new mountain plate, essentially became a flying cannonball. This was not the end, however. He didn't fly out of the city until much later. I decided to try and pull a rain of fire and hook my weapons into the dragon that I was currently flying at. But I rolled a 1 on that as well. And in a Looney Tunes fashion, I went splat against the dragon's hide and peeled off, falling to his death, to Auric's death. And
From a flying city, no less.
from a flying city, no. So this is miles up off the ground, as D12 said. And I decided to have a last bit of dark humor. As Oric is falling, I tell D12 he's going to write his last will and testament onto his armor. Because he knows he's going to die. There's no way he's going to survive this fall. Unless a miracle happens. I saw him roll a percentile and no miracle, I guess. So he craters in the earth like a space marine drop pod. If you cracked that armor open after he impacted, all that would have come out would have been red jelly. And the sad part is, he wrote that will on his armor for the party to find later, so that someone else in the party could use the armor. Party went in a completely different direction. No one found the armor.
And no one got the mountain plate.
Nope.
Alright, now it's also important to remember that as a dwarf, you get some very nice perks, like dark vision.
Didn't help with those traps, though.
Dwarves also get bonuses against certain creatures, like orcs, goblins, and the like. And dwarves also receive a bonus to their AC against giant-type enemies, like trolls, ogres, or hill giants. Dwarves are also very resistant to combat maneuvers, like attempted bull rush or trip attempts, because they have this feature called stability, at least in Pathfinder. Go ahead.
Stability only works, however, if your dwarf is standing on the ground. It won't work, however, if they're in the air.
Very true. So if you're on a flying mount or falling from a flying city, stability is not going to help you.
Nope. Or if someone decides to try and throw the dwarf.
You never toss a dwarf. Alright, so, and then you also get access to the dwarf family of weapons. That's any weapon with dwarf in the title, so if your DM homebrews a dwarf longbow, which is really just an axe, or a dwarf quarterstaff, you have proficiency with it, no matter what class you are. Alright, finally, let's talk about some famous dwarves that can maybe spark your imagination in terms of RP or just where you want to go with your character. So obviously, I'm very fond of the dwarves from J.R.R. Tolkien's fantasy novels set in Middle-earth. There's Gimli, son of Gloin, and then there's obviously the company of dwarves from The Hobbit.
Thorin, Oakenshield.
Yeah, Thorin, Oakenshield, and Sleepy, Grumpy, Doc.
No, now you're going into Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Oh, sorry, my bad.
Different story completely. Sorry, Disney.
All right, and who were you thinking of?
I was thinking more along the lines of the Inheritance trilogy by Christopher Paolini. It's a great fantasy story. At least it's what I remember it being a great fantasy story. I haven't finished the series yet, and I really need to take the time to. But like I said, the dwarf in my story was inspired by a dwarf character named Oric in that story. And of course, as far as video games are concerned, you have Varric from Dragon Age 2, and then you have Oghren from Dragon Age 1.
All fine examples of hardy dwarves for hardy adventuring.
And Oghren being the perfect example of that tough fighting, hard drinking dwarf.
Alright, so in the game 3.5, dwarves are basically the same as in Pathfinder, but I don't believe they get the +2 to wisdom, right?
No, I don't believe they do.
Finally, dwarves in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition receive a +2 to their constitution modifier, but then there are two sub-dwarf races. Hill dwarves, which receive a +1 to their wisdom modifier, and an additional hit point per level, and mountain dwarves, who get a +2 to their strength modifier, and have automatic proficiency with light and medium armor, regardless of class. Thank you for watching D6 Damage and our racial spotlight on the dwarf. If you're interested in more race, class, or other analysis videos about Pathfinder or 3.5 D&D, check out D6 Damage right here on YouTube. Thank you for watching.